AlphaZero's victory over Stockfish was an historic achievement. AlphaZero was given the basic rules of chess, and in just 4 hours, by playing against itself, became arguably the strongest chess-playing entity on the planet. And then after it conquered chess, for good measure, it did the same to shogi, but it took just 2 hours. And this is the real achievement, that machine learning can be applied to solving problems in different kinds of closed systems, complex closed systems, but using the same algorithm. That's revolutionary. I think for the moment, for the chess world, there are no real implications. This technology is not freely available. However, looking at the games that were published along with the paper, it does seem to me that there is a difference in the style of play of AlphaZero compared to other chess engines. I don't claim to be an expert in computer chess, but it seems to me something different is going on. And what I'd like to do is show you 2 games, one in this video, and then I'll make another video with the other game. And, well, just talk you through, try to explain what's going on in these games at the very least. So this game, AlphaZero White. It's a very regular opening, a Queen's Indian, and in fact this particular line of play was seen in the Anand Carlsen World Championship match in Sochi in 2014, for example. But it's a favourite line of play, this idea with c6 and d5 of Grandmaster Tivyakov. So it's a kind of closed Catalan after castles and d5. But AlphaZero played e4, and again, this is known theory. And e takes d5 was that Anand Carlsen game I mentioned. But AlphaZero played e5. It's noticeable in its games that quite often it liked a space advantage. Knight comes into e4. This has been seen before, and previously taking on d5 had been seen. And, well, in this position, because black manages to grab that dark squared bishop, it's not so easy for white to attack on the king side, and this bishop has reached a reasonable diagonal. That's reckoned to be okay for black. But instead of that, AlphaZero played castles, which actually is a novelty. It has been played before by in an amateur game, but certainly not with the intention that AlphaZero had. So the reason this was thought that castles wasn't really possible and not very good is because of bishop a6, winning a pawn on this because of the pin on this diagonal. But AlphaZero played b3. It was exchanged and pawn takes pawn. So black has won a clear pawn for nothing, but now AlphaZero closes the position with b4. So this is a really long-term positional sacrifice. There's the extra pawn. White can't get it back. Indeed, after b5, you definitely won't get it back, creating this pawn chain. And yet AlphaZero has somehow divined, intuited, whatever you call it, that actually white has fantastic compensation. It wouldn't think of it in those terms. So let's see why. Well, basically it's to do with this space advantage. So as white has already castled, now it's time to maneuver pieces. So this knight is spinning around to this excellent square on e4. And the queen comes out to g4. Well, I mean, those are pretty natural human moves, I would say. Knight on this excellent square, and the queen using this space advantage with this lovely spearhead on e5. So this is a very natural human attack. And here I would have anticipated maybe, well, h4 looks a reasonable move to me, starting to get things going on the king side. But instead, AlphaZero played much more positionally with knight c5. So basically, well, I mean, black can't live with this knight here, so that was exchanged off. But this ensures that this bishop is absolutely dead. It's just not going anywhere at all. And, well, I suppose, you know, black can cling on to the hope that this protected passed pawn will one day be, yeah, an asset in the position. But so I think this is really interesting. It's very long-term compensation. And although white has some space and potential for attack, there's certainly nothing immediate. Black played a5. Now obviously white has to keep this pawn here to keep everything locked in, so the pawn on b4 was protected. These are exchanged, and exchange on a1, and now queen d3. Now it's at this moment where, I mean, perhaps a few moves back, that a human might have rejected this whole line because the queen's incursion looks so strong. But in fact, AlphaZero has calculated very well that the queen can be expelled, and it hangs on this particular variation. Here, Stockfish realised that the queen wasn't getting anywhere and just retreated to d8. But of course, the crucial move is rook a3, pressurising the bishop. But then comes bishop e4. Now, this is very easy for a computer to see. Your average chess engine will spot this, but from a human point of view, it's a little bit tricky. At first, you might think, rook takes, bishop takes queen. Yeah, this isn't quite as clear as one would wish. Rook and bishop for the queen, and maybe this passed pawn can play a role. But here's the trick. After rook takes bishop, you flick in this move, rook d1. Now that, for a human, is very difficult to see because the queen is trapped. And the point is, if queen takes rook, well, this is completely different, of course, compared to the other position, because queen d7 threatened, and if the bishop comes back, well, you can either bring the queen in like this. That's probably the simplest, or you could take here. So therefore, well, both machines saw that rook a3 wasn't possible, so Stockfish just came back again. So clearly there was a problem with its horizon if it didn't see this idea straight away when it played the rook to the a file. Now after bishop e4, white has control. So again, this is very long-term compensation for that pawn. White has control and starts to build up on the king side. Reminds me very much of games by Magnus Carlsen, actually, where he also doesn't mind giving up material for a kind of positional bind. So black just simply doesn't have counterplay here. King g2 from white, so this potentially prepares to swing a rook to the h-file. At this point, well, I checked this with my Houdini 6.02, which I think is one of the latest iterations. And at first it thinks this position is about equal. After thinking for a bit, it starts to favour white, but only thinks it only has a slight advantage. I mean, at this point, even for a human eye can say, yeah, white definitely has comp here, and this is extremely dangerous because black has no real counterplay. But yes, clearly AlphaZero thought so as well. And here's a nice move, queen h5. So what this does is just create a slight weakness. So if h6, then the queen comes back and it'll be able to set up a battery on this diagonal. Therefore g6 played, knocking back the queen, but now of course it's possible to, you've got something to bite on the king side with h5. Still no counterplay for black. Everything down the d file is covered, and there was no point in moving down the a file. And here's a nice moment. Obviously, black is chasing the queen exchange. This may be tenable for black, and the queen g4 is possible here. But instead, AlphaZero played queen f6. Now this is an excellent move. I think as a human we could see that this endgame is actually going to be, well, I think we could even say winning for white, because once, I mean, basically white can squash black on the king side, so the bishop isn't really getting out at all. And then, well, perhaps bring the rook in. That will probably lead to a rook exchange. Then we move the bishop in, trade bishops, and, well, of course, by this stage the king will be on some square like d4, and the king will be able to march in on the weak and dark squares. So, I mean, a human can see that. Not so simple, I would say, for a machine. That, you know, might go beyond its horizon. But AlphaZero clearly assessed this endgame absolutely correctly, and you know, I find that fascinating. As I said right at the start, it could be that other chess engines would also find that. I mean, Stockfish rejected the endgame as well. And now the rook hits the H file, so building up nicely. And so it's forced after this trade. I mean, this damages black's pawns terribly. Stockfish 8 still thinks this position is equal, but white has managed to damage black's structure. So, you know, white is definitely making progress. And this is a nice move. Bishop b2 with the idea bishop c1 and bringing this bishop into the game. And once it gets to f6, some sack will happen on g6. So this is horrific. And interestingly, Stockfish 8 changes its assessment to 1.38 in white's favour at this moment. And indeed, at this moment, Stockfish panicked in the game. It played c3. I think a human would probably do something like this and try to block that bishop out, but in this kind of position, well, this must be fantastic for white. This extra pawn really doesn't count for much, and crucial thing is that bishop is still dead. But c3, panic. That's a panicky move, because actually white doesn't need to keep going on the king side. It can simply round up that pawn, you know, like some lost sheep, and then return to the pressure on the king side. So if in this position bishop takes, then bishop takes rook, and well, white has a winning position there, just need to get that rook into the game. So here, bishop g5, rook f8, f6, keeping everything nice and locked. Now, I don't like h6, but this is an unenviable position. Well, I mean, I say I don't like it, but I mean, maybe there's simply no defense to the rook coming to the d file because the d8 square is covered, and that must be over. So I guess h6 in some senses is forced, but it leads to an absolutely miserable endgame. This is very nice. AlphaZero gives up a pawn temporarily, but after this queen exchange, it means that the rook can now enter on a7. Interesting, isn't it, that black has been left with this absolutely rotten piece against white's wonderful piece, and of course the rook very active as well. So it feels as though AlphaZero has this whole game under complete positional control. So now if bishop c8, rook c7, the rook came back, so now AlphaZero has recovered the pawn and just has a massive positional advantage, and this is, well, pretty easy by now. If king e7, then we reach a kind of Zugzwang position. If the king retreats, then white's king goes forward, and if forward here, and if the bishop moves, let's say here, then the rook comes across and the king comes in anyway. Stockfish gave up a pawn, that was taken off. And now, well, for me the most elegant way is to move the king in, similar to that last variation we just looked at, and this is going to be winning. But instead, AlphaZero swept the rook round, I mean, I love the kind of grand strategy that White is carrying out here, but I preferred the Zugzwang position. I mean, this is completely winning now. Pawns get taken. I may as well go to the end of the game. I mean, there's absolutely nothing that Black can do here. White's king and bishop just take the pawns on the queen side, and well, I think we can all see that this is utterly winning for White. And here, finally, the plug was pulled on Stockfish. I thought that was pretty remarkable. I mean, there were just a few moments there which kind of made you go, huh. So this moment, reaching this position, and AlphaZero, even though it's a clear pawn down, assess this as, well, let's just say playable for White. And this moment with Queen f6, again, able to assess that endgame absolutely correctly. So, I mean, this was a brilliant long-term strategy. And as I said, it reminds me very much of games that Carlsen plays. Well, in the next video, I'm going to present another of AlphaZero's games against Stockfish, and it looks nothing like this whatsoever. And that's also fascinating to see. So look out for that one.